Hi, in this topic we will see what is a third normal form. So when you talk about the third normal form, there are only two requirements. It should fulfill the requirements of the second normal form and it should eliminate the transitive dependency. What do you mean by transitive dependency? Let's try to understand. So this was our earlier table, score table, right? This was the score table. But if you want to work on the third normal form, remember that it should be in a second normal form like this. And then the table which is in the second normal form can only undergo the process of third normal form. Now, in the score table, we were missing few details, and that details are nothing but exam name and the total mark. Okay, just to tell you once again, for the score table, the composite key was the primary key. For the score table, composite key of the student ID and the subject ID was the primary key, right? And marks was fully dependent on the student and the subject ID. That is nothing but what? The functional dependency. Marks dependent on both student ID and the subject ID. Now, exam name and the total mark. These are two new things we need to add to track the details of the mark. Now, if you see this thing, you can imagine exam name also dependent on the fully dependent on the primary key. Primary key, when I say with this regards, it's the composite key, a combination of or the composition of student and the subject. Well, exam name both depend on the student and the subject. So if you are engineering student, you might be knowing that there are some optional subjects. Few student takes, few student skips, right? Or they choose some another subject. Means if this student is having E111 exam, it's not the case that this student will also have the same exam. He or she might have opted for the another optional, right? So name of the exam is dependent on the student and the subject. How on the subject? Consider that for the maths there is no practical, but for physics there is a practical, right? For maths there is no practical, and for physics there is a practical, which means that student plus subject, right? Student plus subject is related to the exam name, and that's why exam name also fully dependent on the whole primary key. In this case, whole primary key is nothing but what? The composite key, right? So marks and the exam name both are dependent on our primary key. But what do you think? Total marks are dependent on student ID, subject ID? What exactly? Is there any relationship between the total marks, student ID and the subject ID? No. Total marks has nothing to do with the student ID and the subject ID. But the total marks are dependent on the exam name. Total marks are dependent on the exam name. Well, exam name is not a primary key. Exam name is not a prime attribute or the primary key column. But total mark is dependent on the exam name, and exam name is dependent on the primary key. So this scenario is called as transitive dependency. Exam name dependent on the student ID, subject ID. Total marks are dependent on the exam name, right? So third normal form says that all such scenarios has to be removed. I hope you have understood this. What is the functional dependency? If the column is completely dependent on the primary key, in this case composition, right? That is functional dependency. Marks depend on these two, Exam name depends on these two. But total mark doesn't depend on these two, this primary key. Total marks dependent on the exam name and exam name dependent on the primary key. This scenario is called as transitive dependency, and this has to be removed. So how do you remove? For removing this, best option you can say create separate exam table, exam details table, and remove these two columns. Don't add it here, don't add it here. So score ID, student ID, subject ID, marks, exam ID, and this thing only, right? So total marks, this column needs to be removed. So you can add this column over here. Sorry. So just write it in the exam table like this column, right? So there is no transitive dependency. Transitive dependency has been deleted, and here there is a reference key, foreign key over here. This is what the third normal form is. This is what the third normal form is. I hope you have understood this session. If you have any query how about the transitive dependencies, about the third normal form, write it in the comment. If you have understood the session, still write it in the comment. Thank you.